Dr. Clarke. All right. Who betrayed the African Revolution? Attorney Alton Maddox opened up an interesting door in history, and he teased you by letting you peep inside of that door for a minute, then he closed the door. I just want to open that door just a little wider, then go to the subject. He mentioned the closing years of the 19th century and the birth of black politics in New York City and the United Colored Democracy under Ed Lee called the Chief. Ed Lee was the kind of politician we don't have anymore. Ed Lee was the chief bellhop at the old Warwick Hotel where the Tammany bigwigs went for extracurricular activities, not necessarily with their wives, of course. So he knew what room to send the scotch, the blonde and the brunette. He knew the dirt on everybody. And the then head of Tammany Hall, Ed Coker, was complaining that the Harlem community was Republican. And he said, the reason why is Republican. The head of Tammany Hall said, not only I will give you some funds to establish a Democratic branch in Harlem, I will put a black man or a colored person or a Negro in every branch of government in New York City. That's one of the few promises made to us that was almost kept. The whip that brought it about was Ed Lee and the United Colored Democracy. When Ed Lee had gotten us, I'm talking about a real black politician, most black parties talk but don't deliver anything but win. Ed Lee got us jobs, assistance to this, assistance to that. So finally Ed Lee said, I'm tired of the little crumbs. I want the big crumbs. I want 2 judges. And so you have to be crazy. You must be crazy. And so Ed Lee, for the Democrats, they chose a Judge Watson, whose son is a federal judge right now. A Republican, one named Tony. Watson was of Caribbean descent, and Tony was of Black American descent. Now, head of the black Democrats was a Harvard-educated man from the ghetto who had developed new curse words. His name was Ferdinand Q. Morgan. Now, Ferdinand Q. Morgan was in opposition to Charlie Anderson, then collector of Internal Revenue for his district, Wall Street. 9th grade education. With enough nerve to go in and tell J.P. Morgan, Mr. Morgan, you ought to think within your tax. And he said, who in the hell is that N dash dash, and who gave him an appointment to see me? The secretary said, I don't think we that the collector of internal revenue, the first district, needed an appointment. He got fired from the first district, of course, and started in the second district. But this man had nerve. You black people ain't got no nerve today. And he could open up a nerve store and sell something. No. Ferdinand Q. Morton was head of the civil service workers. And when they appointed him, this is Ed Lee's manipulation now. He's asking for the big crumbs now. These are his first two big crumbs. The white civil servants said they will not work under that N-word, dash, dash. And Ferdinand Q. Morton was going to Harvard. He could speak all those low language with a Harvard accent. He said that I know a whole lot of unemployed niggas, well educated. If any of you think you're not going to work under me, I can have them down here in your job tomorrow morning. Because they need the job, they want the job, they won't take it. The next day, they were right in their seats, working under Ferdinand Q. Morton. And for the next 27 years, that's what they did. What we're talking about is the beginning of Harlem politics. Now, Ed Lee wanted two judges. Watson and Tony was chosen. Because when Ed Lee asked for this, they said that you don't have no people who can be a judge. Ferdinand Q. Morton made some of the choices and told Watson, you just go down there and judge something. You just as good as all those wops and kites and everything else. So because Watson came from an area where he had seen his people judging something, schoolmasters, and so he didn't have much problem being a judge. Tony had never had that experience. He didn't even believe they were going to accept him anyway, so he went down to North Carolina to see his mother. And when he came back, Ferdinand Q. Morton had some new curse words for him, and he became a judge. That's where we got our first two judges. I'm saying that these men opened the door for the career of Adam Powell. The first Harlem Renaissance. There's a literature on it. There's a literature on everything, you know. Roy Otley, in his book New World of Coming, has written on it. Gilbert Osowski, in his book Harlem, The Making of a Ghetto, has written in detail on it. The book Harlem on My Mind is written on it with pictures, and if you forgive the modesty, the introduction to my book Harlem, A Community in Transition, and another book, Harlem, USA, has a capsule history of this political emergence of the Harlem community. I have emphasized this because history sometimes tells you where you've been in order to tell you where you are, so you can estimate where you still have to go. Right. And because I'm a classroom teacher, when someone puts a subject, throw a subject out, I want to broaden the subject. Or to tease you with the subject, I just want to teach you a little more about, open the door just a little wide. And I'm going to close the door to that subject and go into the subject for tonight. We first have to define what exactly is a revolution. And our crisis today is that we do not seem to understand that a revolution means complete change. In a revolution, you do not patch up an old society. You replace an old society. When a society has grown old and weak and fat and flabby and fails to serve its people, the conscious role of those who have suffered from that society is not to prop up that society, but to change that society in such a way it will never be the same again. When that society was originally built on your sweat, your life, and the tears of your mother and your father, you not only have the right to change the society, you have the responsibility to do so. First, let's look at the revolution of the 19th century in the African world and find out who betrayed that revolution in the 20th century. You cannot fight to become a part of the apparatus of your slave master, else you re-enslave yourself. For your job is to destroy that apparatus. Early in the 19th century in Africa, when the chattel slavery system was turning into the colonial system, another form of slavery. Remember, slavery is never abolished. Slavery is transformed. Now it is computerized. Only the slave can destroy slavery. And you cannot destroy slavery by becoming a part of your slave master's culture incubator. You have to understand what happened to you in this transfer from one society to another. You develop in a cultural incubator that was collected and homogeneous by virtue of being connected. The people who enslaved you put you to another culture incubation that lacked culture, it lacked humanity, that used religion as a utility to move things from one place to the other. They could not even afford to mean democracy, could not even afford to mean Christianity, because the very existence of that power and the way it existed was anti-Christian and anti-democracy. So they had to preach about it in order to try to convince themselves that they believed in it. Now when you go back to the original culture that you had before the interference, you didn't preach about it, you lived it out. And when you create a religion, you didn't say, I am my brother's keeper, because if you are genuinely your brother's keeper, you don't shout it out, you just keep it. You live out the culture. And this man proclaims the culture and betrays the culture. And when you get confused between the incubator that created you and the one that enslaved you, you got a problem, and that is our present day problem. Now, how did that problem come about? And what have we misunderstood about ourselves to create that problem? We have misunderstood the 19th century black activist, black minister. We had misunderstood the connection in the African world in that 19th century. When that chattel slavery system began to disappear because of it being unwieldy and not because of any goodness of anyone's heart, you will discover, if you read it well, that most of the abolitionists, the white abolitionists, were fakes and phonies. And Sharpton, Granville Sharp, said in his own literature, though I am a Christian, I have found it difficult to put my hand in the hand of another African Christian, and call him brother. He was talking about Equiano, the greatest of the African Christian slave narrators, who was more Christian than he. And yet when we look at Granville Sharp's life, while he was against slavery as an unwieldy system, every legislative act against child labor in England, he voted against it. Every act to approve the lot of women, he voted against it. And when the British want to use colonies as a dumping ground for unwanted women, unwanted population, he voted for it. He had no humanity for even an Englishman, people of his own kith and kin. So this man with the greatest reputation as a British abolitionist was a liar and a faker. The Africans began to understand this fakery early in this century and started a series of wars to break the British hold and the French hold on their country. In South Africa, a series of Zulu wars would last 256 years, starting with the entry of the Dutch in 1652, ending with the last Zulu War, 1906. In West Africa, a series of Ashanti wars, starting 1800, ending 1900 was the last Asante war fought by a woman, yea, Asante war, exile. Finally broken by the famous West Indian regiment. That requires a whole lecture that I will not get into tonight, because if I got into that lecture fully, I would need a 6-pack and 6 handkerchiefs. There were wars motivated by the spirit of African Islam. Now this is difficult for you now, because you're so hung up with Arab Islam. You don't know that there's another Islam. Yeah. And African Islam began to set these wars in motion in West Africa, against the French. Second Touré's grandfather, Soumari. In the Sudan, a man called the Mahdi, means the holy man, Muhammad Ahmad. He's the one that fought with this famous Fuzzy Wuzzy warriors who were not Muslim, but he unified the whole Sudan. Further to the south, a war started by another devout Muslim, Muhammad bin Abdullah Hassan, called the Mad Mullah of Somaliland. All over Africa, in North Africa, a war against the French started by Abdul Krim, continued with another African who did not lose power till 1956, Raul Pasha. My whole point here is that all Africa was at war in that 19th century. And in the Sudan, we have the British going back to avenge the fact that the Africans had driven them out of the Sudan, going back with a superior army under General Wingate. This war was reported by a young British reporter, Winston Churchill. And one of the finest jobs of war reporting since Caesar came home from Gaul is called the River War. The same Churchill would report on the last of the Zulu War in a book called A Roving Commissioner, when he would recall that Africans had out-generaled some of the finest military men of Europe. And these Africans never wore a store-bought shoe, a hood of a military school. Now this 19th century war in Africa was set the 20th century war in motion. Near the end of that century, missionary Africans began to appeal to the conscience of the colonialists, only to discover that in a game of power, consciousness is absent from the makeup of the European. Now, in the Caribbean area, early in the 19th century, they had already fought some of the best strategized slave revolts in history. Haiti had become free. Jamaica had fought harder without being free. There were revolts in South America, Palmares, the Bar Beach revolt in Guyana. All of these revolts happened before the American Revolution. The revolt in Palmares that gave the Americans its first republic was before the American Revolution. And yet, these Africans got left out of history because it wasn't on Europe's side. Haiti furnished haven for South American activists, especially Simon Bolivar. And once he established South American freedom, he would turn on the very Haitians who had helped him. My main point in dealing with the Caribbean revolt is the fact that Caribbean people, even today, in their self-congratulation, misunderstand this aspect of their heritage and do not understand. If they've had the most successful revolts, slave revolts of Africans outside of Africa, it had nothing to do with them being braver than others. Slave masters in these areas bought in large lots and kept the lots together. Therefore, he thought he could work them better that way. They were right, but they could revolt better that way. They had linguistic continuity, cultural continuity, drum continuity. So when that one beat the drum, that one over the hill know what the drums are saying. They could maintain a system of communication. In the United States, where they bought in small lots and broke them up, they saw African people fighting for themselves, not waiting to be free, because the Civil War wasn't about the freedom of slavery in a way. And if you think any white people fought 4 years over you, then that wasn't water you've been drinking. They were fighting to unify the United States. Now this would bring us to that second half of the 19th century. In the United States, the betrayal of the Reconstruction, and from the betrayal of the Reconstruction, 1880, 1876, to the emergence of Booker Washington, called the nadir, the period of our lowest era. By 1895, whites got tired of dealing with multiplicities of leaders, so they began to choose them for us. They chose Booker T. Washington and anointed him, and gave him the publicity, gave him the means. Some people were for him, some people were against, but in spite of the fact of being chosen, he did some innovative things in education, still good for us. And because we didn't like some of the things he did, we turned against some of the useful things we still need. And thus, all of us came into the 20th century. The Caribbean islands, angry fighting over Constitution. The Africans, the end of the warrior nationalist period, the beginning of the missionary trained political activists in this country, the end of the physical struggle, the beginning of another struggle. Great black journalists, T. Thomas Fortune, William Monroe Trotter, the midst of the Du Bois period, the Booker T. Washington period, a fight for education, a fight to build independent black institutions, a fight over the name. All of this as we came into the 20th century. Now this is the African Revolution. That was the preface to the 20th century revolution that we betrayed. Why did we betray this revolution? We have to look at the years in both Africa and the United States and in the Caribbean islands, because who was in charge? Who were the spokesman in the main during those years? People who thought our greatest hope was to be like our oppressor, other than to destroy our oppressor. And though they fought for a new society, they would model that new society after the corrupt and dying society of the oppressor. Now, when the Africans began to ask for a new society, they were asking for an African-dominated society, but most of the Africans asking the questions were trained by the oppressor. They had forgotten their own methodology of rule, and so the methodology of running a state was taken from the oppressor. The oppressor never develops the methodology of the liberation of the slave. Powerful people never educate powerless people in what they need to take the power away from them. The aim of powerful people is to stay powerful by any means necessary. If they have to buy up the wheat, they buy up the wheat. They know something which you have illusions about. The weak will not inherit the earth. The strong will inherit the weak. And the status quo will remain the same. The earth will always be ruled by strong people. And if you want to rule it, become strong. Stand on your own turf. When we look at those years in Africa after and between World War I and World War II, the people that they looked for and looked to bring a government into being were nearly all trained in European schools. There was nothing wrong in them being trained in European schools. So was the Japanese. But the Japanese got proper instructions before they went to the European school. Your job is to come back and make a Japanese nation that can defy those people, that can outproduce those people, that can remove the humiliation of those people. And so they came to American schools, were insulted, and they came with their little cameras and they're taking pictures. And everybody think, oh, those silly little Japanese. By the time they went home, they could make everything they took a picture of. Took a picture of a train, go home and make a train. The Africans didn't do that. The Africans were too busy being the imitator instead of the innovator. He wasn't preparing to be sovereign. He's preparing to imitate his slave masters ruling of a nation, and his slave masters' apparatus would never fit him. So the revolution was being betrayed before the revolution occurred. And I don't mean just Africa. The same thing was happening in the Caribbean, because people were moving in planes who would play a color game, who would play the economic game, who would play a class game. No one was speaking directly for the people who work, the ordinary people, the people who have to labor. Everybody with an education had their nose in the air. The common people had no advocate. Until the common people have an advocate, you have no revolution. Now, after World War II, they were fighting for constitutional government, fighting for land reform, because the British had reserve land, crown land, anything to keep the people, keep the land out of the hands of the people. They could pull this trick all over Africa. You couldn't exactly put it in West Africa. Land tenure just to remain intact, thanks to a man named Casey Hayford in Ghana, who wrote an excellent book on it, The Truth About the West African Land Question. Jomo Kenyatta wrote a good book about the East African land tenure. Very few people read it. Kenya, Land of Conflict. When you take away a people's land, you take away their nation. You take away their birthright. You might as well take away a woman's womb and tell her, go have some more children. It's impossible. No land, no nation. So the land was being lost in Africa. The land was being fought, although in the Caribbean islands, they made a better fight of it than most cases. And some of the land was returned to the people. And they did have some redistribution of land. But the elite who participated in the redistribution of the land ended up buying up some of the land. And so they exchanged a British land-owning aristocracy for a black island land-owning aristocracy. Power changed faces, but power did not change methodology. So power remained out of the hands of the people. In 1945, Kwame Nkrumah, who had been in America, was back in England, attended the Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England, along with Padmore. This was the theoretical beginning of the African independence explosion. In 1947, he was called back home to be secretary to Joseph B. Danquah, who headed the United Gold Coast Convention. He pulled the young people out of the United Gold Coast Convention and founded the Convention People's Party. It was under the banner of the Convention People's Party that he led Ghana to independence. Because of the glamour of Nkrumah of the moment, and the moment in history, a whole lot of people rallied behind him who really didn't believe in him and who ultimately betrayed him and deserted him later on. The United States did not want to see the role model of a well-functioning African state any place in Africa, because if you produce one, you can produce 10. Produce 10, you can produce 50. So they made up their mind between French intelligence, British intelligence, United States intelligence, that that nation had to be destroyed. but they had to knock off a few nations. After Ghana, the independent fever started growing. As the independent fever started growing, the traders grew just as fast. The Mabutus, the murder of Lumumba, Shambe, the African Onkatan. Then Africa was in shambles. Different cleavages in Africa based on who was a Muslim and who was a Christian and who was an animal. Freedom wasn't about religion, freedom was about freedom. You could be free under either one or slave under all of them. Religion should never have been part of the issue, but they were hiding behind it. Now you have a Caribbean Federation concept propagated but falling apart because of inter-island rivalry. Norman Manley was of the opinion that Jamaica would have to end up paying taxes for some of the smaller islands. Had some questions about Jamaica's role in the Federation. While this talk was going on, and the best intellect of the talking group was Eric Williams. Finally, Eric Williams went home and discovered he had some oil and some money. So he told them to go to hell. He went his way. So the concept began to fall apart. In the United States, a fight for equal pay for teachers was converted into a fight for equal education. But what called the larger issue to the attention was the Montgomery bus boycott and the emergence of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King emerged into a situation created before he arrived. He was drafted and placed into a situation. A very common man named Dixon was really in charge, and he chose Martin Luther King to head the movement because Dixon was a common ordinary man, woman, porter type. He not only split infinities, he created some new ones. All of us have to remember that English is not our mother tongue. That we want to chop it up once in a while. That's our privilege. Just don't chop up Yoruba and Igbo and Hausa. These are our mother tongue. We speak them correctly when we get around to speaking them. As for English, well, we wasn't born with it. It was fastened upon us. What I'm trying to get to is that because we sent students to school without giving them a nation mission when they came out of school, they didn't understand the nature of their commitment to us. So in the Caribbean, they become English. In the United States, they become, I'm an American, man, I'm an American. And the only way you can find out whether you're an American very easily is to try to catch a cab downtown. If you can't pass the taxi cab test, forget it. He don't care where you're from. That bigoted cab driver is a better paying Africanist than most of us. He look at all of us as the same. The opening of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was moving with leaps and bounds. It had another leap took on a different meaning after the Emmett Till case. We need to seriously study the impact of the Emmett Till case. And study the events to the March on Washington, where the movement began to stagnate. Then they threw out some money, almost $1 million, between 6 organizations, with the agreement they'd all work together. Working together killed that creativity. So when the money was gone, nothing was happening. Then came the killer period. Kennedy, then King, then Malcolm. The politics of assassination. They say the kind of politics of assassination is happening in Africa. In the Caribbean is the politics of exile and banishment. Keith Henry has written a PhD thesis called Tigers Abroad and Meek Moses at Home. Conservatism and radicalism in the Caribbean mind. Dealing with the conservative factor of the Caribbean mind at home and the radical factor away from home. It's a phenomenon that deserves at least 3 or 4 more PhD theses. For my radical orientation in my early years in New York City came from Caribbean radicals to a great extent. Street corners of Harlem, step ladders of Harlem, Raphael Powell, J. Rogers, Richard B. Moore, Pettione, and all these groups, those fighting for independence of their respective islands, and some of the best debates I've ever heard, calling attention to the writings of some of the finest Caribbean scholars, forgotten now. I'd rather hear anybody mention T.A. Marichal of Grenada, Cycles of Civilization. One of the few radicals that stayed on in the Caribbean, did not migrate, and died there. Saw his son in Barbados, total disgrace to his father, nothing but a white woman chaser. He let that go. Well, that's a tragedy that pops up in the most unusual places. But what I'm trying to say, and I'm trying to conclude, is that in the United States, and during the Civil Rights Movement, young people worked for $10 a week and wore blue jeans and opened up a door for a generation of blacks to go to schools that they never would have been able to go to. And a generation later, those same blacks began to look down their nose at the very people who had opened those doors. And some of them began to advocate the closing of the doors in the face of those who had opened the door. And an army of traitors appeared in the whole African world. Paid traitors. Some of them in government, some of them called chiefs, some of them heads of state, some of them on the periphery. But all they got out of it, Mercedes-Benz, some a Swiss bank account. The premium was a European woman, very easy to get. And our mistake is that we did not take the Japanese approach.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
You line up 10 young men You said sociology for you, engineering for you, oceanography for you. You understood what went into the making of a nation. You trained at least 10 men for every item. So by 1905, the Japanese were so strong they kicked Russia's butt. And people began to talk about the yellow danger, the yellow pill. We shouted nation time too soon. We shouted nation time before we understood what a nation is. To have a nation, you must know everything that goes into the maintenance of the nation. If you have shouted nation time and you do not produce the safety pin that hold your child's diaper together, then you have shouted prematurely. You weren't ready for nation time. If you got to depend on someone else for the food you eat and producing none for yourself, then you're not a nation. A Mercedes-Benz will not make you a nation. A limousine will not make you a nation. You're just an inadequate fool with a chauffeur. The next time, if faith is kind enough to present us for the next time, we better know what makes a nation. We better deal with our traitors. I advocate the reestablishment of the old African brotherhood with an accompanying sisterhood. An internal security force. We won't take you to the white man to be punished. We will punish you so well we won't have to do it too many times. When you do wrong and see us coming, you'll run to the white man because his punishment is so less than ours. If you talk nation time, you got to think nation time. There is no salvation for this people except some form of Pan-African nationalism. You got to stop worrying about those little specks of dust in the Caribbean islands where the slave ship put you down, and worry about where the slave ship took you down, took you from. The common denominator must be out. This does not rule out you being proud of what particular island you came from, but priority over this is that we are all African people. If there are a billion of us on the face of the earth, we better learn how to speak with a single voice. Reach out to the Africans in the Pacific Islands, those in India, those in Sri Lanka. Maybe 1/3 of all the Africans in the world live outside of Africa. Africa might have the lock to its future, but I think we got the key. We got to get that lock and that key together. We have to deal with Africans who are now with their nose in the air, talking about, I'm a pure African, you're a descendant of a slave. If you're that stupid, you are the slave. We have to build a world where we'll not only not be a slave, but we'll not be a slaveholder either. And we build a common humanity for ourselves that will benefit the whole world. But first and foremost, we'll build it for ourselves and for our children and their children still unborn. But we have to deal with people who betray our revolution. We have to identify them and punish them in such a way others will have second thoughts about betrayal. We have to find a partner for our revolution. Now, I suggest you start with yourself and a mirror. And don't move until you like what's staring back at you. And unify with those people throughout the world. Recently, keep popping up in every lecture, in every question and answer period, the advisability of interracial marriage and interracial dating. I have said that is the descendant and the great-grandchild of the same people who brought you over on those filthy ships. And you betrayed these Africans who suffered by laying down with him when no people have made amends to us for what happened to us. Maybe after they pay us compensation over and above their national treasury and help us restore our sovereignty, I might think about it as a conversation. Well, who told you that that the people that look like you wasn't good enough to sleep with? And if you got a problem about who to sleep with, then you got a problem with the people who produced you. How did your mother look and how did your father look? You mean to tell me they were wrong in bringing you in the world the way you look? You mean people who look like you are not good enough for you? You got to go to slave masters to get a mate? You have no respect. No people will be free until they love themselves so much that they rise above slavery, even at the risk of death. We have to stop shouting to the world about being black and beautiful. Because if you believed it, you wouldn't have to shout it. You would walk into a room and everybody will know that beauty is here because you are here. I have often said we can change the world if at first we change ourselves. We must remember, the world is not ruled by blackness or beauty, it's ruled by power. And black and beautiful means nothing unless ultimately
You are black and powerful. Thank you.